Hello, my name is Noemi Huanca Nunez, and I am a PhD candidate at the School of Biological Sciences and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And today I am happy to welcome you to the effect of seed dispersal on forest regeneration during succession in human-modified landscapes. The study of forest regeneration is an urgent need that is being pushed forward thanks to the passion of researchers, like the ones included in this slide, but not limited to this list, who are including or doing long-term studies and comprehensive studies, trying to understand the key factors that limit or favor the regeneration of these secondary forests. And this is because, as we know, deforestation is a critical problem and a permanent problem that is happening year to year. And as we know, most of the original global extent of tropical forest has been lost to deforestation, caused for many factors, such as conversion to agricultural use and posterior abandonment, fires, hurricanes. However, as we know, the primary drivers of the deforestation are related to humans or are in some way human modified landscapes. So since given the key role that forests played in moderating the climate and also giving us the ecosystem services, the understanding of how secondary forests regenerate is of critical importance. And the goal of this symposium is to integrate the results from successional forests in order to characterize how local and landscape factors affect seed dispersal in human-modified landscapes and their consequence for forest regeneration, to analyze the potential challenge on the regeneration of human-modified landscapes. For that, we have these amazing speakers. So we have here Dr. Sahawi, Associate Professor from the University of Hawaii in Honolulu, and now Director of the Charles Darwin Foundation. We have Dr. Marines de la Peña Domenech, Associate Professor from the Instituto Tecnológico y de Estudios Superiores de Occidente in Jalisco, Mexico. We have Dr. Miriam San Jose, a postdoctoral researcher from the Charles Darwin Foundation in Galapagos, Ecuador, and myself. First, before starting and giving pass to the talks, I want to remind you first that you can submit your questions for the speakers anytime during the presentation, but please make sure to do it in the Zoom Q&A, using the Zoom Q&A button and not the question function in WOBA. So again, the Zoom Q&A button. And the third question, please indicate to which speaker you are addressing your question. And with that, I want, please give the welcome to the speakers and the talks that we're gonna listen today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this talk. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how proximity and abundance of mother trees affects recruitment patterns in a long-term study, restoration study in southern Costa Rica. I've worked in this part of the world for the better part of 20 years. It is a pre-montane wet forest habitat at about 1,200 meters in elevation, with about 3.5 to 4 meters of rainfall per year. This region has undergone tremendous land use change over the past 60 or 70 years, going from a forested, entirely forested state over here in the mid 40s to a progressively more fragmented and agricultural region shown here in the more recent survey about 6 or 7 years ago. If you zoom into this area that we quantified and look at it in more detail, you can see the sort of distribution of remaining forest. The dark green is old growth forest, and then the orange patches are all young secondary forest that's coming into the system. It's within this matrix that we, a colleague, my main collaborator, Karen Hole, and I started a long-term restoration project called the Islas Project, where we established 13 1-hectare sites in this landscape. Starting in 2004, we set up 3 different treatments, each a 1/4 hectare in size, natural regeneration system shown here. Each one is 50 by 50 meters. Here we did not plant any tree seedlings. We also had a plantation treatment where we planted the entire area with seedlings. And then we had what we call applied nucleation or island system, where we planted patches of trees of 3 different sizes in this 50 by 50 meter area. 4 species were planted, and we also had adjacent reference forest plots for comparison at some of our sites. The idea behind applied nucleation is to establish foci of regeneration, or which mimics the natural regeneration process, whereby 1 or 2 individuals establish in an area and facilitate the establishment of others. Ultimately, if successfully, you can apply this methodology to a much broader area that you're considering restoring, because it is much less labor and resource intensive. Key to this study that I'm going to talk about today is our landscape level question, which is whether forest recovery in these restoration plots is more strongly affected by within site restoration strategy, i.e. what we do on the ground, or proximity to the surrounded landscape, i.e. what's surrounding each one of these plots, whether it's forested area or agricultural land. Today, the sites look something like this. You've got the plantation here on the left, uniform canopy, 15 to 20 meters in height, fairly open understory. The natural regeneration, much sparser canopy, but there are some recruits that you can see in there. And then, of course, the applied nucleation somewhere in between, with some open areas in there as well. More specific results and patterns we've seen in our study. Frugivores, structure attracts birds. That's not a surprising result. And so consequently, we've had higher abundance of frugivores in our 2 planted treatments shown here on the far right, as compared to the control or natural regeneration system. So more birds visited our sites. By extension, we wound up with more seed dispersal in these planted treatments shown here, as compared to the natural regeneration. These are animal dispersed tree seeds. Surprisingly, however, no surrounding forest cover effect was found in this study. Again, looking at seedlings recruiting in the system, you can just focus on the graph here on the far right, the bars over here. These 2 bars, the shaded and black bars, are the 2 planted treatments, again, the islands and the plantation, and more than twice the number of recruits per meter squared as compared to the control. Again, animal dispersed species, but once again, no landscape effects. So you could either move to the conclusion that perhaps forest cover is not that important, so local factors are more important, or what we do on the ground is more important than what the forest cover is doing or affecting. Or alternatively, this simplified categorization of forest cover into essentially a binary presence absence. Is it there? Is it not there? And quantifying that as a percentage is problematic for assessment. And to that end, we decided to look at this question a little bit more closely and look at the relative importance of the spatial distribution, abundance, and life history traits of key species of mother trees on recruitment patterns in these plots. And we predicted that in doing so, and going down to the species level, that the mother tree presence, abundance, and proximity to these plots would have a strong resulting impact on recruit abundance of respective species. What did we do? We selected 8 of our 13 sites, shown here with red dots. Within each one of these sites, we surveyed 77 tree species that we had selected in this 100-meter band that you can see here highlighted in translucent white. The yellow dots are mother trees of one particular species that we surveyed in this particular site right here. And then within that, we also surveyed all the seedling or all the recruits within the grid of the plantation that you see here in red. We only focused on plantation for this particular study. We surveyed a total of 1,485 mother trees belonging to 72 species and a little more than 9,000 recruits in the study. The vast majority were animal dispersed species. We did exclude a few species of early successional trees from the survey that are really ubiquitous in the landscape and not at all dispersal limited. And we didn't think that was an interesting group to include in the study. So what did we find? Well, first off, just the simple presence of a mother tree in that 100-meter band results in an, on average, 10-fold increase in recruitment levels. So here's presence, here's absence, and number of recruits here on your y-axis. Big shift in the number just by having at least one mother tree present. Looking at abundance, on your x-axis here is the number of mother trees going from 0 to about 75, and then your recruit abundance on your y-axis split by 3 different bands, the closer inner band of 25 meters around the restoration plot and then further out. And what you can immediately see here is the abundance of mother trees increased recruitment quite strongly within that 25-meter band. That response was really notable, but not so much for the 50 and 75-meter bands. That abundance response was much stronger for larger seeded species, and this is one example here of a large seeded species with many mother trees surrounding one particular plot right here, and lots of recruits. Just one mother tree individual here with far fewer recruits, and then only one recruit here in the case of no mother trees in the surrounding 100-meter band. Proximity was also important, more so for larger seeded species, which you see here in the solid line. Again, this is increasing mean distance of mother trees to the restoration plot. So right next to the plot and then further away. And so when you're very close to the plot, you have on average more recruits. Again, this is animal dispersed species, and this is small seeded and large seeded. So the effect of proximity is stronger for larger seeded species. One example, here's a large seeded species with a mother tree right next to the plot and a lot of conspecifics recruiting. 3 mother trees that are further from another plot and far fewer recruits, and then again, even fewer still when you don't have a mother tree within that 100-meter distance. Of course, there are anomalies, there are always exceptions. There are other factors besides dispersal limitation at play, such as predation, such as light environment, drought, etc. But to conclude, a few broad points here: the presence, proximity, and abundance of mother trees near to restoration sites is strongly linked to recruitment patterns. This was evident from the graphs I just showed you. Large seeded species appear to be more sensitive to this than smaller seeded species. The majority of recruitment was explained by mother trees found within that 100-meter distance. So rarely were recruits found, but no mother tree did happen, but it was very few cases. Broader generalizations or conclusions are twofold. One, that species diverse remnant forest fragments are really key to facilitating rapid community reassembly in adjacent restoration areas. So in other words, the percent of forest cover is important, but more specifically, the species composition of that forest is really essential to quantify and understand. And by extension, doing that a priori, doing that before you actually plan restoration activities can really determine the degree of restoration intervention that you need to do in a particular area. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you for your time, and I will stop here.
Hello, my name is Marinés de la Peña, and I will be presenting the effect of restoration treatments on seed dispersal and establishment limitation in a tropical agricultural landscape. Our work takes place in Los Tuxtlas, Veracruz, Mexico, the northernmost tropical rainforest in the American continent. Due to cattle grazing, most of these landscapes are open pastures, and they are very fragmented. So in 2006, we established a restoration project that had as objectives to restore ecological interactions, specifically seed dispersal processes, and also movements of plants and animals within the landscape. We have 3 treatments with 8 replicates, and these treatments were plantings of animal dispersed trees that would provide food, safety, and shade, plantings of wind dispersed trees that would only provide safety and shade, and control plots to contrast and mimic natural succession only by excluding cattle. These were planted in 30 by 30 meter plots, and the planted treatments had 12 species per planting treatment. To assess dispersal and establishment limitation, we use the density index. Dispersal limitation is the failure of seeds of a given species to arrive, plus the proportion of seeds in the total seed pool that belong to species 1. Establishment limitation is the failure of seedlings to establish in stations where seeds of that species did arrive, plus the proportion of seedlings in the total seedling pool that belong to species 1. We used 96 seed traps, 4 per plot, and we identified and tagged all of the seedlings that were higher than 10 centimeters in 676 square meters in each plot. This is how the landscape looked in 2005, and this is how it looks like today. These are active pastures, and so cattle goes along all of these places without any restriction. Dispersal limitation was greatly reduced within all treatments, but specifically in animal dispersed plots. In terms of establishment limitation, there's still a lot of establishment limitation within all of the treatments, but there's a distinctive pattern for control plots and wind dispersed plots that was reduced and then increased again. This did not happen in animal dispersed plots. This is how the treatments might look like today, and I wanted to show it to you because they might help to explain the patterns that we're looking in terms of dispersal and establishment limitations. So in a control plot, you mainly see grasses, some trees, some shrubs, yes, but mainly grasses. So wind currents would come through here with no obstacle carrying wind dispersed seeds, but animals might not be attracted to this particular space. In contrast, wind dispersed plot with very tall trees, but mainly homogeneous canopy bearing heliocarpus and ochromas that produce a lot of seeds that might fall within the same plantings. Wind currents would not be able to cross through these plantings, so mainly the seeds that are carried by wind would just be stuck on the border of these plots. In contrast, animal dispersed plots have a very heterogeneous canopy, and we see immediately these cecropias that are already producing a lot of fruits, and so a lot of animals are crossing through these plots. And so most of the seeds that arrive are not from the species that we planted. When we looked at dispersal and establishment limitation by dispersal syndrome, we saw that for dispersal limitation, animal dispersed species reduced their limitation greatly over time. But again, wind dispersed species was reduced in their limitation, but then increased again. And you can kind of figure out the story where at the beginning, all of these seeds from wind dispersed species were very easily arriving to the plots, but then as the plantings grew, then the limitations also increased. For establishment limitation, there is a pattern where wind dispersed species are getting more limited, and the opposite for animal dispersed species, which are increasingly less limited in establishment. So over time, dispersal establishment limitation shifted from animal dispersed species to wind dispersed species. In 2007, you could see very few animals crossing in the landscape and very high wind currents carrying wind dispersed seeds all over the landscape. In 2013, in contrast, you could see more animals crossing to arrive to these plantings, and also the wind currents were being stopped by the plantings. Here we show dispersal limitation by treatment and dispersal syndrome. The continuous lines represent animal dispersed species, and the dotted lines represent wind dispersed species. So dispersal limitation was reduced the most in animal dispersed plantings for animal dispersed species, but limitation for wind dispersed species generally decreased but then increased again in controls and in animal dispersed plantings, but not in wind dispersed plantings. In this other graph, we present establishment limitation also by treatment and dispersal syndrome. Again, the dotted lines are wind dispersed species and the continuous lines are animal dispersed species. So establishment limitation showed the opposite pattern for control plots and for plantings. In both of the planting treatments, limitation was reduced for animal dispersed species and increased for wind dispersed species. Dispersal and establishment limitation varied significantly between species over time. Overall, most species were less limited, but most species were still highly establishment limited. Dispersal limitation was reduced for several species over time, but for establishment limitation, only 2 species were reduced. Both of them are non-pioneer animal dispersed species. These are Bursera simaruba and Tabernae montana donnell-smithi. Through this study, we have shown that planting treatments reduce dispersal and establishment limitation for animal dispersed species. After 9 years under natural succession or controls, dispersal and establishment limitation have not shifted from animal to wind dispersed species. Although in a broad context of restoration, natural succession is the most cost-effective strategy, many sites with long periods of intensive management, such as cattle pastures, do not recover species composition or densities easily. Strategically designed plantings can both restore ecological interactions and species diversity, specifically if these plantings include rare species or those that are most unlikely to arrive by themselves. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, my name is Miriam San Jose and I'm going to present effects of landscape structure on seed dispersal in Mexican fragmented rainforests. Deforestation is a big threat to biodiversity, particularly in the tropics, where most of recent deforestation occurs. The tropics lost 3 to 6 million hectares of primary forest per year in the last years, mainly due to agriculture and cattle grazing. This deforestation changes the landscape structure. The landscape structure refers to the composition, which is the land covers that occur in the landscape, and the configuration, which refers to the spatial arrangements of these land covers. But not only deforestation threats biodiversity in the tropics, also overhunting causes the defaunation in this forest. The half of tropical forest is under hunting pressure. Here you can see in the red areas where large animals are absent. The absence of these animals impacts the forest, since most of tropical trees are animal dispersed, and these fauna are the only ones able to disperse large seeded trees. So one can imagine that human-modified landscapes have altered ecological processes such as the seed dispersal. Isolation and matrix openness limit animal movements among forest remnants. Also, forest loss decreases animal seed dispersal because it reduces the seed sources, and also it reduces the habitat for this fauna. And defaunation promotes the lack of seed dispersers, directly impacting the seed dispersal processes. So here we investigated what is the effect of landscape structure on seed dispersal, and if these effects differed between regions and between dispersal modes. We hypothesized that landscape structure and regional context affect seed sources and seed dispersal processes, shaping seed arrival to a site. For example, in more forested regions, animals are able to move among fragments, and there are plenty of seed sources. Meanwhile, in more deforested regions, the structure of the landscape could have stronger effects on animal movement according to the spatial configuration of the fragments and the type of matrix. Also, the effects should be different for animal and for wind dispersed species, as landscape structure have different impacts on these dispersal vectors. For animal dispersed seeds, we expected positive effects of forest cover, edge density, and density of fragments as they promote connectivity, but negative effects of matrix openness and isolation. For wind dispersed seeds, forest cover could have positive effects because it increases seed sources, but also negative effects because it limits wind flows. Matrix openness could have positive effects because it promotes wind flows, but negative effects because it affects seed sources. The same for isolation. To test this, we made a study in two floristically similar regions in the southeast of Mexico, Los Tuxtlas in the Gulf of Mexico and La Candona near the frontier with Guatemala. Los Tuxtlas is a more deforested region where severe deforestation started in the 60s. It has a stronger influence of winds, and it's considered a more defaunated region. Meanwhile, La Candona still has almost half of its forest cover. Deforestation is more recent. It has less influence of winds, and all the fauna is still present. We selected 20 sites per region and obtained this landscape structure metrics in several buffer areas. This to assess the scale of effect of each of these landscape metrics on the response variables. In the center of each of these sites, we place 9 seed traps, and we collect seeds for 1 year each 15 days. All seeds more than 3 millimeters were identified and counted, and also in a plot surrounding these seed traps, we identified all adult trees in order to know if seeds were local or dispersed. A seed was considered dispersed if it was not represented in the tree community. Overall, we found more than 67,000 seeds from 171 species. Los Tuxtlas had almost 6 times more seeds than La Candona, but species richness was similar between regions. From dispersed seeds in Los Tuxtlas, most of them were wind dispersed. Meanwhile, in La Candona, we found the opposite pattern, with most of them being animal dispersed. Even if there were no significant differences, we can see that most of the sites in Los Tuxtlas had less animal dispersed seeds than sites in La Candona. When comparing the diversity, we found more alpha diversity of rare, common, and dominant species in Los Tuxtlas, but less beta diversity than in La Candona. This means that the same common and dominant animal dispersed species are arriving to Los Tuxtlas sites. The landscape structure effects on seed dispersal varied between regions and dispersal modes. The species richness and abundance of wind dispersed seeds was more strongly related to landscape structure in Los Tuxtlas than in La Candona. The most important variable was the edge density, and contrary to expected, it had a negative effect on wind dispersal. Forest cover and matrix openness showed positive effects, and patch isolation showed both positive and negative effects. On animal dispersed seeds, we found that in both regions, the species richness was more strongly related to landscape structure than the abundance, but the effects were different according to the region. In Los Tuxtlas, isolation increased the species richness and was the most important variable. Meanwhile, in La Candona, the most important variable was forest cover, and it increased the species richness of animal dispersed seeds. The pattern found in Los Tuxtlas could be due to animals in isolated fragments could be using more resources, as this has been shown for primates in the same region. So as conclusions, more deforested and defaunated regions may present limitations in animal seed dispersal. The effect of landscape structure on seed dispersal depends on regional context and dispersal mode. Some of landscape structure effects are that forest cover increases animal seed dispersal, and this has been shown in previous studies. Edge density decreases wind dispersal because it could be that live fences, riparian corridors, and irregular edges act as barriers for wind flows. The matrix openness increases wind dispersal and decreases animal dispersal, as expected. And isolation could increase the species consumed by animals in more deforested regions, and fragmentation did not show significant effect. So different conservation strategies for preservation of seed dispersal should be done in regions with different amount of perturbation. For example, in Los Tuxtlas, it would be highly desirable to increase the amount of frugivorous fauna and increase the forest cover. Meanwhile, in La Candona, it's very important to stop defaunation and deforestation. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any question.
Hello, my name is Noemi Huanca Núñez, and today I will talk to you about seed rain successional feedbacks in wet tropical forests. As we know, most of the original global extent of tropical forests has been lost to deforestation caused by many human activities, being one of the most important the conversion to agricultural use and posterior abandonment. Here, we focus specifically in these areas, and we denominate these areas now after human-modified landscapes. Seed dispersal is a key process that establishes the initial template for seedlings, saplings, and trees, so it can affect the recovery and the maintenance of species diversity. Yet, seed dispersal is increasingly disrupted in contemporary human-modified landscapes.
Also, in general, all these plant stages are influenced by processes that regulate them as a community. For example, two important processes are the determinism and the stochasticity. Determinism produces directional and orderly changes in species abundance and composition to time, with convergence towards a climate community, which will make the late successional communities to also be more similar to each other. Recent studies have viewed determinism mainly as a function of successional niche, defined in tropical forests as a replacement series from early successional light-demanding species to late successional shade-tolerant species. On the other hand, we have stochasticity. And stochasticity is viewed as arising from non-deterministic outcomes, which combined with priority effects can lead to idiosyncratic successional trajectories or late divergent non-heterogeneous communities. Seed rain in secondary forests will be affected by these processes. But first, an important factor is the seed source. And for seeds coming from the surrounding landscape, it will be important the proximity to the species composition of the seed source, the availability and the diversity of the dispersers, and the landscape context influencing the movement of the seeds. Seed rain into secondary forests can also be affected by the successional trajectory of the forest vegetation itself, creating seed rain successional feedbacks that operates in addition to the assembly trajectories defined by successional niche. So we define here seed rain successional feedback as a deterministic assembly process. These feedback are different from successional niche because successional niche arise due to changes in local environmental conditions, such as understory light availability. For example, the understory of older successional forest sites have lower light availability, which increasingly favor the establishment of more shade-tolerant species as succession proceeds. In the case of seed rain successional feedback, the feedback is driven by the particular species present in the overstory and not by changing environmental conditions. And so in this case, priority effects are magnified by limited seed dispersal in human-modified landscapes. So in this study, we have two specific questions. The first question is if seed rain in successional forests are more shaped by stochasticity or determinism. And the second question is how the strain of successional niche and seed rain successional feedback change during succession. For this talk, we are focusing only in the question number 2. So in order to answer this question, we use 5 sites of different successional ages in La Selva Biological Station in Costa Rica and areas nearby the biological station. And we combine both time series and chronosequence approach and collected seed rain for 4 years, in 96 and 97, when the sites were ranging in age from 12 to 25-year-old, and then 20 years later, when the sites were 32 to 45-year-old. And we also collect data in mature forests. In all these plots, we collected seed rain in traps and identified each of the seeds to the species level. With that, we found the following results. First, the taxonomic composition of the seed rain differ across forests of different successional ages and across both time periods and between secondary and immature forests. As we can see here, the seed data in 97 and 99, here in the red labels, are in a different space in the ordination than themselves 20 years later, that will be here in the blue label. And these sites themselves are in a different space than the mature forest, but closer to the mature forest. So now specifically to answer about the strain of successional niche and seed rain successional feedback, first, we use similarity indexes. So in this case, each of the secondary forest sites was compared to the composition of the mature forest in 97 and 99, and then each of the secondary sites in 2015 and 2017 were compared to the mature forest. And we can see here that regardless of the similarity index used, meaning present absence, abundance weighted, or dominant species, the seed rain in each secondary forest site became more similar to that of the mature forest over time. Similar results can be observed in the functional convergence here in figure D and E, where the percentage of the species here in the y-axis, for example, of large seeds, are increasing by successional time, with successional time being portrayed in the x-axis. The same with the shade-tolerant species that is increasing as succession proceeds. These results are consistent with the successional niche assembly process. We also compare the between secondary site similarity. In this case, each of the secondary sites were compared with each other in 97 and 99, and then in 2015 and 2017. And we can see here that in general, and more clearly in figure D, present absence, the similarity between secondary sites decreased by time. And this could be explained by successional seed range successional feedback that will be explained shortly. So here we have the seed range successional feedback. And in this figure A, each of the dots will be a species. And we can see here that the taxonomic composition of the seed range here in the y-axis is correlated with its tree abundance that is here in the x-axis. And also the strain of this correlation is increasing with successional age, as we can see that the late successional forest sites that are here inside the blue box have higher and significant values than themselves when they were 20 years younger. This is consistent with increasing importance of seed range successional feedback that will act to reinforce priority effect, producing divergent seed range patterns across these secondary sites. The increased importance of seed range successional feedback is also supported by figure B, where we can see that the proportion of immigrant seeds here in the y-axis are decreasing by successional age, with successional age here in the x-axis. So with this result, similarly, we expect that the strain of the seed range successional feedback will increase as human modification of the landscape increase from low to high, because human modification of the landscape involves many processes, including deforestation and reduction of the matrix permeability that will affect the seed. This increase in the strain of seed range successional feedback will be driven by the declining proportion of immigrant seeds with successional age, and this will have consequence for the spatial heterogeneity of the species composition when comparing between secondary forest sites. So this will result in increasing convergence through succession in less human-modified landscape, as deforested sites should recover faster and receive many seeds from a larger proportion of the regional species pool, because more seed sources are near and the dispersal agents can still move. In the case of increasing divergence through succession, this will happen when there is more human modification. In this case, many seed sources will be out of reach, and so the regeneration becomes more strongly influenced by priority effects, followed by local within-site seed range as succession proceeds. As a result, seed range successional feedback will create greater spatial divergence among secondary forest sites. And lastly, increasing convergence through succession should happen in the case of the most severe human modification. In this case, this will happen because the adult tree will be strongly constrained to represent the most well-dispersed generalist species from the regional pool. Finally, if the imprint of the seed range successional feedback persists to the seedling and later stages, then the secondary forest in human-modified landscape should continue to diverge as succession proceeds, creating historical contingent landscape of forest sites in compositionally dissimilar stable stages. So with that, we have the conclusion first that even though seed dispersal is often highly stochastic, we can see also an insignificant increase of determinism as succession proceeds. Second, seed range successional feedbacks can promote divergency. And third, seed range successional feedback may become more influential in increasingly human-modified tropical forest landscapes. With that, I want to thank you for listening to me, and also I want to thank all the support that this research has had.
Hello, now we're gonna go to the Q&A part of the symposium. So I will start by the question for Dr. Zach Sahawi. So is there any loss of a large seed dispersal around your study site? And could you explain to some extent why the large seed species had much lower recruitment in the patches?
Yeah, I was just in the middle of typing a response there. There are large seeded dispersers in the system in southern Costa Rica. It is a highly fragmented landscape with about 30% or so forest cover remaining. So most species are still present, but some are large seeded dispersers are rarer. But you don't have the severe hunting pressure that you do, for example, in Miriam's study in Los Tuxtlas. So I think we actually had a good number of recruits of later successional large seeded species in the study, but it's important to clarify that this study was not a comprehensive evaluation of all species in the surrounding forest. So we picked a large subset, but it's not a complete representation, and we also excluded some smaller seeded species. So it could have a bit of an impact in terms of large seeded dispersers being rare, but they are present, and I think the overriding driver are the factors. So.
Thank you. Now we have another question for Marines from Thompson Jill. Rather than wind dispersed species not reaching the ground in the wind dispersed plots, was it not that they didn't germinate under what looks like a closed canopy in your picture?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So it's both. At the beginning, the wind currents could bring the seed dispersed seeds all over the landscape. But once the canopy was high enough, we started receiving a lot less wind dispersed seeds. But also wind dispersed seeds are very inefficient at establishing. So the seed to seedling proportion for seed dispersed species is very high, sorry. And so kind of the quality of the seeds also matters. And wind dispersed species, as Miriam said, in Los Tuxtlas are very abundant, the wind dispersed species, but they rarely establish. So it's a matter of both components.
Thank you. For Miriam, were there a difference in the types of animal dispersed seeds in Los Tuxtlas versus La Candona? You are mute.
So, yeah. Oh yeah, I just answered that one in the chat too. The thing is that in that study we didn't assess for the seed size, even when we found that in both regions most of the seeds arriving were small sized seeds. And also regarding the animal dispersal syndrome, also most of the seeds were endosuckerous, no? So we didn't have the numbers for assessing between, more specifically between endosuckerous or ectosuckerous seeds.
Thank you, Miriam. Now I want to go to a question for all the speakers that is related to one of the questions that is here. What do you think are the implications of the results that you just show for the active management and regeneration methods? Can we start by Zach?
Can you repeat the question again? What are the implications for active
for
management?
the active management and regeneration methods coming from the results that we just saw today?
Yeah, I mean, speaking for
building off of, sorry, Zach, building off of Antonio Crespo's question there about kind of the relative, how much can we manage out the effect of the landscape, right? A lot of the speakers' talks today showed that the surrounding landscape matters in one way or another, mainly via the effect of mother trees. That's a huge one, as you showed. And so, you know, Antonio's question was, do you think the presence of mother trees might be more important for restoration success than different planting schemes are? And so kind of elevating that to the larger question of how can we use what everybody has found here to kind of modify and change or direct any kind of restoration. Sorry,
Yeah.
now I'll let you talk.
I saw that question. It's a great question, and it's a synthesis of basically, at least as far as our project goes, the first 10 years of what we've been reporting, and then some of what we're finding now. And the answer is we don't really know yet, but that's what we're going to do next. So what was missing in the study I just presented is this is a subset of species that we surveyed, and only in the plantation system. So it limits your ability to compare treatment on the ground to landscape level. So the next step is to actually survey all recruits in all 3 treatments, because right now we only work with permanent plots, which is a tiny subset of what's coming in or what's recruiting. So we know everything that's in the system at a given time point, and then map mother trees in the surrounding landscape and percentage of forest cover. And then you can really look at that question. But I mean, in a broad sense, I think they're both critical. It depends on what's going on in your surrounding landscape. And that to some extent determines what you should be doing on the ground in terms of restoration.
We follow with Marines, please.
Sure, I completely agree with Zach in this matter that it really depends on the context. For example, in Los Tuxtlas, the land is too valuable, so natural regeneration rarely happens. One, because the landscape is highly modified for very long periods of time, but also the land is very expensive, and so there are no abandoned lands that you can just leave to natural regeneration. And also, natural regeneration doesn't necessarily accelerate things, or sometimes you get kind of arrested succession in those areas. In this
We lost Marines.
Yeah, it seems like she's frozen. What, Miriam, do you have anything to add at the moment? And then maybe Marines will come back.
Yeah, I think here a key point is that what is surrounding the regeneration plot matters, no? In terms of how is configured all those 3 covers, in terms of the composition, but also, as Marines showed, and Noemi also, that what you are planting on your active restoration treatments also shapes what is going to arrive, no? So I think there are like those 2 levels of, okay, what you put in there in several years is going to have an impact of what is regenerating, and also what is around, it's going to also filter what is recruiting in the restoration plots.
Thank you, Miriam. Marines, if you want to continue what you were saying, you can continue. But I think
I honestly don't even know where my connection.
Yeah, I think we are losing the connection. We can have a written answer sometime later from Marines. I'm gonna continue with the questions. We still have some time. So there is another question for Marines, but I will put it in the WOBA app and you can see the answer. I'm gonna copy the question and you can see her answer. I'm gonna go with the next question.
I think I'm back.
Oh, okay, great.
Sorry, my connection is not very good.
Okay, there is a question for you, and it's about were you able to evaluate change in frugivorate richness community composition alongside the change in animal dispersed species and quantity? This is an effect of dispersal and establishment. That's a question by David Lee.
So we do have a study of how frugivorous birds and bats have changed within the landscape. This is not part of what I have studied, but there are people studying that aspect. And the quality of this effect. And yeah, of course. So as larger birds and bats have come into the plots, we have been seeing larger seeds, and those larger seeds coming in have a better probability of establishing successfully. So so yes, this is something that is changing for this study. I only used the 10 most common species because they had to be present in the seed rain and in the establishment census, and they also had to be present in one of the like in the first year, the 5th year, and 9th year. So that reduced the number of species that I could use. But of course, we need to also do this next test where we integrate other species that are arriving with larger seeds.
Thank you for your answer. And now there is just a couple of minutes. So first, I want to tell everybody that if there is some question that is still not answered, I'm going to create a community in WOBA with the name of the symposium where you can still post new questions if you have and see the answers for these questions. And second, I just want to briefly summarize what we have seen today. So first, we have seen the facilitation, the importance of facilitation for regeneration. So when there is conditions for natural regeneration, in some places, like we can see in Costa Rica or in Peru, there is areas where can naturally regenerate, and it's locals, like Marina said, and it's a path to go. But there is also cases where facilitation is increasing the regeneration of forests, as we have seen. We need to check the importance of local factors, like the parent trees that Zach was just talking about. And there is an importance for increasing the studies and focusing and disentangle these factors, because we just see indicators that are limiting or favor regeneration, but we still have a long way to go and still study the landscape and the within side factors. So with that, I want to thank the speakers and everybody for being here, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.